In this next tutorial, we're going to look at how to manually apply an audio transition to an edit and then adjust it, and then also how to apply multiple audio transitions over multiple clips. First of all, to add an individual audio transition, you need to navigate to your Effects tab. This is usually in the same area as the Project tab, and click on it. This will give you access to all of your video and audio effects and video and audio transitions. I'm going to go into Audio Transition, Crossfade. There are three main crossfades to choose from. Generally speaking, constant power is the most commonly used of these three. That creates a crossfade between two clips that tries to maintain the average audio level between the two clips over the duration of the transition, i.e. you don't hear a noticeable dip in audio level as you play the transition itself. To apply this transition to an individual edit, there's two main ways of going about it. The first method is to drag and drop the audio transition onto the relevant edit. Before you let go, there's three main ways of positioning the transition. You can position it centered on the edit, ending on the edit, starting on the edit. I'm going to go for centered. What that then does is, over the duration of that transition, it fades the first clip down and the second clip up. To do this, it has to extend both clips. So the first clip here has now been extended by ½ a second this way, the default duration for the transition being 1 second. And the second clip's in point has been extended by ½ a second this way to give us this 1 second overlap between the two clips. Where you have to be careful with this is you may put a transition on a very tight edit, and by putting the transition on, you may then hear some audio that you initially trimmed out of one of the clips. Once you've placed the transition on an edit, it can then be adjusted in a number of ways. If you double click on a transition, it will open up the Set Transition Duration dialog, and you can type in the duration that you want. So for example, if I wanted to change the duration of this transition to 2 seconds, I would click in here and change that to 2 seconds. And when I click OK, you can see the transition gets longer on the timeline. You can also manually trim a transition. You move over either end of the transition itself, so you get this little brackety trim symbol, and you drag in or out, and it will tell you underneath the new duration of the clip and how much you're adjusting it by. You can also adjust the duration of an audio transition by selecting the transition and clicking in the Effects Controls panel. And here again, I can now click in the time dialog here and type in a new duration. This time I'm typing in 2 seconds and 0 frames. Notice I don't have to put the leading zeros in or the colons that divide each set of units, but I do have to make sure that I put any following zeros in, i.e. even though there are no frames, I have to put in the fact that I want 0 frames. Hit enter. That again adjusts the duration of the transition. And then I also have a little graphical representation of the transition in the Effects Controls window, and this also allows me to move over either end of the transition and trim it in or out. The difference is here though, as I trim one side, it doesn't trim the other. So this allows me to offset the transition as well if I want to. Now you can offset the position of the transition on the timeline, i.e. so there's, say, more of a fade before the edit than afterwards. In here you would do that by making the necessary adjustments to the overall duration of the transition, and then clicking in the middle of the transition and dragging it left or right, and that offsets its position. So if I go there, I've now got about 3/4 or so of my transition before the edit point between the two clips and 1/4 afterwards. The same process can also be done in the Effects Controls window by clicking in the middle of the transition and dragging it left or right up there, and that has a direct correlation to what you're seeing on the timeline. One other quite useful thing you can do with the transition controls in the Effects Controls window is move over the center point of the transition here. You see I get a roll symbol, and I can then roll the edit between the two clips with the transition on it, and I can do that without having to pick up the roll tool. So what that is doing is moving the edit position between the two clips, extending one clip, trimming the other, and moving the transition with that change. Finally, also in the Effects Controls window, if I want to reset my transition, so set it back to center at cut or switch it to start or end at cut, there's a little drop down menu that allows me to do this. And these controls here, in terms of duration, alignment, and the graphical controls over here, are the same controls that you would see when you applied any of the other two audio transitions, or for that matter a video transition. An alternative method for applying a transition to a specific edit, if I just delete the one I've got there, is to highlight the edit itself or move the playhead over the edit. Both those options would target a specific edit on the timeline. And then to go to the sequence menu and choose apply audio transition, or use the shortcut for this, which is Shift Command D. What that then does is applies the default audio transition and applies that to the selected edit on the timeline. Incidentally, if I wanted to change my default transition, all I do is go to the audio transitions bin in the effects tab, do a right click on one of the other transitions and choose set selected as default transition. I'm just going to delete the transition off the timeline. You do that by clicking on it to select it and hitting backspace. And I'm just going to zoom out again so I can see all of my clips. It's not uncommon with audio transitions to want to put a short audio transition between a number of clips. So here's a really quick way of applying a short audio transition over all of your edits in a sequence. First of all, you need to set the default duration of your audio transition to what you want. You do this by going to the Premiere Pro menu on a Mac or the Edit menu on a PC and choosing Preferences, General. In there, you can then set the default duration for your audio transitions. You can measure this in frames or seconds. I'm going to switch to frames and I'm going to set this to 12 frames and then click OK. Instead of my default audio transition duration being 1 second, it's now 12 frames. To apply this to all of the clips in my edit, I first of all need to select them. So I'm just going to use the shortcut Command A on my keyboard to do this, or you could also quite happily just click and drag a marquee over the clips that you wanted to select. Then I'm going to go back up to the sequence menu and I'm going to choose that same option again, apply audio transition. This then puts the default audio transition, which is now a constant power 12 frame transition, on all of the audio edits on my sequence, including the start and the end of the first and last clips within that sequence. As you can see there, the type of transition is constant power because that's the default audio transition again. If I double click on this to show you the duration, it says 12 frames. Obviously then for individual transitions you can just go in and make individual adjustments as I've shown you previously.